Assalamu alaikum, everybody. My name is Javed, and I work for the American Civil Liberties Union, and I'm a graduate of UMD. And so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about intersectionality and Islam and what that means for us in the Muslim community. So to begin with, I want us all to go to a moment that I think that many of us, if not all of us, have been to. It's personally a moment that I'm frequently at, sometimes multiple times a day, so hopefully it's something that we share in common. And so the moment that I want us to imagine for a second is that you're either watching the news or you're reading an article that somebody posted on Facebook or on Twitter, and say it's about the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And you're reading this article and you're watching the news, and in about 30 seconds, sometimes even less, it becomes really clear how biased the coverage of the news is, or how biased that the writer is of that article. And you see quickly that oftentimes in the American media, that the Israeli victims of what is going on in Israel and Palestine are the only ones who are awarded any type of humanity. That their suffering and their voice is the only one that comes through. Their names, their body counts are the ones that make those bold black headlines. But the Palestinians, they're never human beings. They're never given that same type of dignity. They're not awarded that humanity. And so we ask ourselves in that moment, how can people's outrage be so selective? How can their compassion be so limited that they wouldn't think that this other group of people are also human beings, and that maybe we should talk about them and include them because they are also people? And so keeping that outrage in mind, keeping that disbelief that we go to, I want to ask us, is it possible for the Muslim community to also make that same mistake of limited outrage? Is it possible for the Muslim community to also limit our compassion to a certain group of people and to a really narrow scope? So what I want to touch on today is, if the Muslim community can do that, and if we do, what does that look like? What form does our limited compassion take? What can we do about it, and why we should change our approach? So to begin with, on this path, I want to give us two scenarios to think about. The first one is how last Wednesday, tens of thousands of people came to Washington, D.C., not 20 miles from where we are all today, right now. And they came to demand comprehensive immigration reform. And that sounds like a really hefty term, but really can be broken down into a list of demands. So it's an end to deportations that tear families apart. It's an end to racial profiling. It's changing a system that is so backlogged that families are kept apart for dozens of years. It is a path to citizenship for millions of undocumented citizens. And I would have thought, given how many immigrants really are in the Muslim community, that this would have been a priority that we push people to attend, and that our state, our local, our national advocacy organizations would have said, hey, this is a big priority because we are immigrants too. That there's fresh roots from all over the world in our community, and we should go and stand in solidarity with an issue that would have an impact on millions of Muslims, no doubt. But there was nothing like that. There was no push. We didn't hear about it on listservs. Our organizations weren't talking about it. And that's a problem. The second scenario that I want to highlight is, I'm going to talk about the Council of American Islamic Relations. And not to pick on them and not to say anything negative, because they are really doing phenomenal work. I think CARE is fantastic. But I think the way that they operate is really symbolic of the way that our community operates as well. So During the 2013 Maryland General Assembly, which is the legislative session in Maryland where laws are proposed, bills are made, they're debated, they're voted upon, hundreds of bills are proposed, hundreds. And many of them have the potential of having a very severe impact, good or bad, on the Muslim community. And the Council of American Islamic Relations office in Maryland testified on only one. And that was on the National Defense Authorization Act, which gives the state the power to indefinitely detain people. So it was a very critical bill, for sure, to testify against. But there were also other bills that I noticed that CARE was silent on. So there was a bill, for example, to ban the discrimination of pregnant women in the workplace. Silence. There was a ban to repeal the death penalty, which disproportionately affects African Americans. Silence. And there was another bill to create driver's licenses for immigrants who don't have documentation. And silence there too. And so I hope with these two scenarios, we can see that we do fall into that same trap. And it might not look the same as when the American media or the American public falls into that same and makes that same mistake, but we make that same mistake too. So the question is, if we do make that mistake, now what do we do about it? How do we start changing that? And there's people in this room, many of them who've already been on stage, who are pushing our boundaries of compassion, who are working towards that every single day. But there's two ways that we as individuals can start to make that change as well. So the first is changing the way that we think about ourselves and our identities, especially in the US. So yes, predominantly the people in this audience are Muslim, but our identities don't just stop there. We're Muslim, but we're also women. We're also people of color. We might be LGBT. We come from working class backgrounds. We might be immigrants. We have a lot of different facets to our identity. And once we recognize that, that then takes us to step two, which is where intersectionality comes in, which is an approach that, since society marginalizes us on a number of different levels, our advocacy and our activism should also reflect that. Because really, we don't overcome oppression as a Muslim community if women are still getting discriminated at work, or if immigrants are left behind and they're racially profiled. Because there are immigrants in our community, there are African Americans in our community. Obviously, that doesn't need to be said, but our advocacy needs to be more inclusive of of our multifaceted identities. So what does an intersectional approach look like? It means for students here, for example, having events with organizations that you wouldn't normally reach out to. So maybe the MSA could do something with the Latino Student Union and say, look, we all have immigrant experiences. Let's put a panel together and talk about that. It's pushing our civil rights advocacy organizations to do beyond just those normal Muslim issues that we fall into the routine of doing. And so, if we are going to change our approach, the natural next question to come up is, well, why? Why should we change our approach? Why should we change the way that we've been doing things for so long, and we know these issues and we know how to advocate for them? And there's two really clear answers to that. And the first one is the most obvious, and that's because there's strength in numbers. I saw that firsthand when we organized the first ever Palestinian Solidarity Week. Yes, there was tremendous support from the Muslim community, but we also had 12 other organizations co-sponsoring as well. And so I think that not only gave us an audience to reach out to, it built alliances, it helped us connect different communities, but it also really gave us a strong foothold when there was so much backlash against our events, against our message. That this wasn't just a Muslim thing, now that there were 12 other organizations also here speaking out on what's going on and how Palestinians are being treated. The second is that alliances go both ways. So when you have, for example, we see this happening really successfully with certain Muslim communities across the country. The first would be, for example, in San Francisco. The Muslim community has really good relationships there with the LGBT community. And so this week we saw how everyone's really familiar with Pam Geller and the anti-Muslim ads that have been on buses, that have been in the metro, and that the LGBT community came out and plastered those buses with signs that said, the LGBT community is against Islamophobes. And so when Islamophobes come out, and then racists come out and attack the Muslim community, because we've built those alliances, they're not just attacking us, but they're attacking our allies too. And that's a really powerful message that can't be denied. And another really great example is the Muslim community in New York, who are working side by side against the stop and frisk tactics of the NYPD, which predominantly affect Black and Latino communities. And so Muslims standing together there with those communities means that those communities will then be standing with Muslims when we are attacked, when we go through racism and discrimination. And so I know that right now it seems like our compassion can also be limited sometimes, but I hope that through these types of discussions and through these types of talks and the questions that we're asking and the people that are here, we can start to change the way that we address our role in the US and the way that we see what is really a Muslim issue and what's not. Thank you.